You are listening to the Indigenous Voices in Resource Development podcast. Today, I'm especially excited because we had the opportunity. Mr. JP Gladu, dear friend, mentor, is our guest on today's podcast. And so JP is principal of Mokwateh, and among so many other things. We probably just spend the next half hour to an hour talking about resume and accomplishments, but I think most importantly, Indigenous, First Nation from Sandpoint First Nation, where this episode is coming. I'm so honored to be in your home, to be in your territory, to be your guest, and excited about digging in today. So thank you, JP, for being a guest on our podcast.
Oh, well, thank you for being a guest in my home, John. And we got to spend a day together out in the land, out in the water, exploring some of the territory. Often you and I chat about, walking two worlds. We spend a lot of time in our suits and the corporate boardrooms and a lot of places in the cities. But I tell you, there's nothing like getting on the land with friends and sharing that experience. And you're a pretty darn good fisherman, I have to say. Not bad from Western Canada.
Right, absolutely. So no, I had an amazing time. I mean, someone who grew up in northern Saskatchewan on the land, where fishing was just a part of life. Had an absolute amazing time, right? It's incredible. And it's especially incredible when you experience that with other Indigenous people in other territories. It's really special. And there's almost some ceremonial aspect to it, some spiritual aspect to it, and to do it with people.
Cool. It was a blast.
That's awesome. So, one of the things we like to talk a little bit about, and I think it's incredibly relevant because we're here, right, on your First Nation, is tell us a little bit about, JP, the Indigenous man, your kinship, your community, how you connect, right?
Interesting, quite a sad, horrible story, actually, when you think about where we are right now. In the late 50s, the government came in and forcibly removed my grandmother and others from the land, just forcibly came in. We went to the site where the community the homes used to be, and the government said, remove your personal belongings, and then they bulldozed our homes and burnt them. And, essentially we were disbanded. And I remember coming back to the land. I mean, I grew up on Lake Nipigon, spending a lot of time in Beardmore with my grandparents, always hunting and fishing in the region. But I was 16 years old when I came back. I remember at the time we had a community meeting on the land with our chief at the time in the community. And it was like, oh, this is where my roots are. I was 16 years old, and this is where my grandmother was born. And Norvell Morso was born here. He was a member of Sandpoint First Nation. And there's nothing like that feeling. This is where my bones are from. And, over the history in 2010, we got the reserve back under my father, Chief Paul Gladu, his leadership. And I was working for the community at the time, advocating to get our land back. And slowly starting to repatriate the land. I was the second community member to move back to the land in 2020 during the pandemic. And I always knew I wanted to come home because you know me, I love being in the corporate rooms. I love working with nations across the country. I like working with companies that want to do good work. But I always, back to the land. There's no place like home. There's no place like being on the land and learning from your community, learning from your parents. My father's taught me a lot about being on land. Now I pass that down to my daughter. One of the proudest moments last fall was when my daughter harvested her first moose, just the two of us. And, it was expert shot, that calf didn't suffer. And then my mom came out with the trailer, and my daughter and I loaded up the moose, and then she did most of the field dressing. And it's just like, having that connection time. She loves coming back to the land. And, it's such a big part of what defines us.
Absolutely. And there's so much in there. Like I certainly identify and relate with. I know, like I grew up in Cumberland House, but I've since moved out. I've had a family, but it's so important. I take my kids back to their communities and reconnect in that way. I'm so glad, their grandmother, their grandfather, and their aunties and uncles are still there. And I'm so glad that they're able to get out and connect. And more recently, I spend much more time intentionally going out with them. I think something I wish I would have done more in the past, but I'm certainly doing much more of it now. And the other part to your story that really resonates, and it's so consistent right across, Turtle Island, Indigenous people, there's such a connection, a spiritual connection like with the land and being on it. I know when I go back, there's just a calmness. Even being here in your territory, and I felt like I could breathe better. Yes, the air, yes, all those things, but it was more than that. It just, there was a peace. There was just a, just a kind of a warm blanket, and you're being out and out with someone. It's pretty special. And so, and that's incredible. We talk about those things, but both you and I, we spend a lot of time in a lot of places, that are very different from that. Like you said, the boardrooms, corporate settings, public engagements, all sorts of things. And there's still that connection. There's still, we enjoy doing that work, but yet, we're very much connected into the land. I have a few things I wanted to chat about, but you touched on something I think that's incredibly important. And so you talked about your history with your community. And it is it's a sad history. And we talk about colonization. We talk about all the ugly things that we hear about in terms of Canada's history, and even into some of the practices today in taking, and displacing Indigenous people and taking culture and land and connection away. But yet, as I know you and as I see you and as you represent yourself, you're someone who's so positive. Regardless of your experiences, you're someone who's so positive, who takes that positive position and wants to bridge things, doesn't look, at those instances in your experience. I don't sense you carrying a lot of anger. I see you just wanting to move forward. So how does that happen? How do you move past being frustrated, being angry, and just like wanting to move forward? As I understand conciliation, right? It's kind of moving past that. And what inspires you that Canada is open to that type of reconciliation, that type of moving forward?
I think anybody that can move through those types of feelings and turn it into a positive, and a lot of people and organizations can do that, I think are in a stronger place because you harvest that history and you learn from it and you move forward. Like Nipkin, as I'd shared with you, the Agolki Reservoir, I was back in the 30s, that redirected the water that used to go to the Albany, comes down into Lake Nipigon now. And then the dams in the south for electricity, Ontario Hydro at the time, now it's OPG and Hydro One, flooded 60% inundation across our land. And I see the impact right there. Every morning I wake up and every time I go to bed, I'm looking at the sunset. The history is pretty atrocious. Our burial grounds got flooded. We drove by some pictographs that are underwater. And it's had significant impact. But then I also look at it, okay, well, that past. I mean, we can dwell on it or we can move forward. And the moving forward part is like, I was on the board of Ontario Power Generation for a while. And, seeing the opportunity for communities to heal through the negotiations and the settlements that happen from it, but also the opportunities, like for instance, Hydro One now for First Nations that own a share in Hydro One and are generating income, the opportunity to build hydro projects going forward. We're talking about the Little Jackfish project again at the top of in our territory here. Nations have real opportunities to build economic sustainability into our communities and mitigating the impacts that have actually happened on the land. And still, as you witnessed yesterday, we still are able to fish this lake and still practice our traditions around the lake and on the land. And so you take the positives out of whatever you possibly can. I try not to dwell too much on the negativity because it can just really bring you down. But it's not to say that recognizing the past it's incredibly important because it is part of who we are, our history.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I have an experience as well too, and having immediate family members, my grandmother being residential school survivor, a lot of family on either side, a contentious relationship with Canada and government and road allowances and all that type of thing. And, and as I grow up and as I engage in the world today, those things are they inform who I am. There's some sadness there, but there's also, and this is where I draw, I think, and relate from your experiences. There's also a desire I see in Canada's people that, we want to move forward. And I think what we're seeing a lot more of is, yes, we need to honor that past and reconcile that through the truth aspect and everything like that. But we want to move together, move forward together. Yeah, I find Canada is in a really good place that we're seeing great strides and getting, I think, understanding each other equitably, and pursuing opportunities together, and really honoring each other's differences.
Yeah, it was a really interesting time right now when we think about Bill C5,
Mm,
15 in BC,
yeah.
here in Ontario, unity projects,
Hmm.
and this opportunity to empower our country. The big challenge right now, there's this rush, there's this identification, this protection of the sovereignty. There's also Indigenous sovereignty in that equation and how we move forward with Indigenous nations. And it's not without a little bit of fear. This country's moved very fast in the past without us, and that fear is baked into this relationship. Are is this country going to move again without us? And I get the sense, and I think you and I are both
Yeah.
optimists in this, that they're Canada is they already made a couple little missteps. I mean, not having us at the table, but I think this federal government, I think even Ontario, because I spent a lot of time here, I think that there's okay. Man, we moved just a little bit too fast. We got to make room for the Indigenous because our rights and our interests on the land, you can't work around those. So
Yeah.
so government has to make the room, but I also encourage our nations to have the courage to move forward as quickly as you can, in making sure that the equity is at the table, making sure that we have oversight of land development and water development, making sure that our rights are respected. But at the same time, there's this thing called opportunity cost. And nations, and a lot of nations that are in the north, there aren't very many opportunities for them to generate any type of economic activity. So these opportunities coming forward, I'm hoping we can get to the table with the capacity, with the resources to support communities so that we're equitable partners, that we have access to good lawyers for the deals, financial advisors for the deals, and not only our elders and our land knowledge holders on the land, but also other, biologists and et cetera that can help us make informed decisions on how we develop this country together. But we're at a pivotal time and it's a little bit, we're in a precarious spot, but we've got to move forward somehow,
Yeah.
and it's a challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And, exactly. Like the opportunity cost, whether or not, we figure this out or take our time to kind of figure this out, the world is moving forward. People are developing, their resources are hitting markets, and we're getting left behind. And I share the same kind of positive, optimistic outlook. And I agree. I think nations have to have that courage and engage in those conversations in good faith. I've seen so much engagement in good faith from government, from industry, and from communities. And when that happens, you build that relationship, you build that trust, and you can move through how you integrate rights and how you integrate environmental impact in terms of monitoring, mitigating, accommodating, removing impacts. But that takes trust, and that takes starting from a position, again, of optimism, of positivity, and, let's do this together. The other thing I've understood too is, we're in such a different time from even just 10 years ago. I get the frustration. Like, I've been in resource development for, I guess my entire life because my father and my parents, my father being involved in resource extraction industry and then, me getting involved in that industry. So it was a big part of my life. And I get that frustration in terms of leaving Indigenous people out and railroading and moving through. But it is so different. It's such a different time. And not just anecdotally as an observer, but also as a student, as an academic, and understanding that.
Yeah.
And, and now nations have the resources. There is enough Indigenous thought leadership to support the integration of people or to support the integration of those aspects into permitting, regulatory aspects and things like that. And so we do have to capitalize.
A lot of this has been done, so there's no secret anymore. The cat's out of the bag.
Yeah. I'm not talking about something new or novel.
This is like it's happening across the country.
Yeah.
We've got some of the biggest energy deals down now, infrastructure being developed with communities. Some of our nations across the country are some of the most well-off communities in the country from an economic perspective. The fact to have, 36 First Nations in BC come together on an energy pipeline deal. It's happened in Alberta, in Ontario with hydro developments. It's happened in Ontario. We've been able to do it. And so this isn't this
hopeful and aspirational.
It's happening.
It's real. It's real.
happening.
Yeah. And I think the challenge is to, is to kind of level set, okay, our communities, look at how this has been done through trust, through in good faith, but also building out a system, governance and economic development that meets the community's needs. And you're absolutely right. We're not talking about abstract, novel, new things. We're actually speaking from the examples of where this has all been done.
You hit something there really important, and it's really the governance, right? Nation governments are important, and there are good governance models and there are poor governance models. What I'd like to focus on a little bit is on from a country perspective, from a nation perspective, is good governance in our development corporations, because development corporations start to become de facto partners in resource development. And, they're owned by the community. The shareholders are the community members. But if you don't have strong governance structures there, they could put projects at risk. They could delay. And for no other reason than we've got a bad governance model in place. The stronger the governance models are for community dev corps, the stronger the outcomes are going to be. Not only from oversight, but also from the economic opportunities, and making sure that community members see themselves in projects and not apart from and adversarial to. So governance is going to be really key.
Oh, absolutely. And then again, we're speaking from examples, or we're speaking from a perspective that said, look where it's being done exceptionally well because there's strong active governance. There is a separation of business and politics. And there is not just a separation, but there's strong governance and coordination between the two. And so some of the more successful Indigenous communities have those governance systems in place. And then, of course, that de-risks. There's more confidence from industry. There's more confidence from the regulatory process, and things move through. And I think an equal key part to that is there's great governance and engagement from the community side, and transparency and communication and involvement and stuff like that. And there's communities that are doing it, which I think leads us to, probably one of the more tougher topics in terms of resource development. And, it's pretty controversial: consent, right? And so it's fascinating. And, I think from some perspectives, we see consent as absolute, but some see it as, it's absolutely, you give it, but how do you sustain that? How do you deliver consent, understand how that looks like, but also how do you sustain in a resilient kind of consent process, right? And so, what do you think nations need to do, or what's the biggest issue that nations have right now in organizing around that so that there is a resilient consent model that can help de-risk, that everyone can kind of understand? Not, of course they're specific to nations, but I mean, what can communities do to get ready to really strengthen what that looks like and to offer that to community and to development?
I think, when we think about FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent, I think the most important letter of that is the I, the informed. And to be properly informed takes resources. And a lot of nations may or may not have the resources to be engaged and informed in an appropriate way. So, government has a responsibility, or proponents have a responsibility to make sure that communities have the tools, have the people, have the resources available so that community can be adequately informed. Because if you're not informed, it doesn't matter what your culture is. There's a fear in that. And if it's fear-based decision making, then you're going to say no. Then that leads to the idea that gets thrown around, and I cannot stand the term veto for anybody, because veto, once you think that you've got that, then it negates the ability or the desire to actually do the hard work to actually come to decision where all parties at the table, especially the rights-based parties, can make the informed decisions around consent. Again, I think it gets around good governance, making sure communities know and understand the informed part about what the economic opportunities are, as well as how land-based development is going to respect the rights and the practices of communities. There's going to be impacts. So how do you mitigate those impacts? A whole understanding of how a community sees itself in project development has to be there so that they can make an informed decision to consent or not. And I think the biggest challenge right now, and the whole consent piece, particularly around multiple, we've done it in pipeline projects, energy projects now, where multiple nations have given consent. And it's incredible, 36 different nations coming together in BC. Was it 23 nations in Alberta? So it can be done.
Yeah.
You know, at a time with critical minerals right now, you have one mine project. I think the mistakes in the past where the government just come in and cast this wide net. Like all of a sudden, you got to consult with all these nations. Well, do you? I mean, because the most impacted nations that are close by start to get confused. Like, why is that nation being consulted?
Yeah.
And they're leveraging that opportunity well, I mean, those opportunities sometimes get really uncertain because there are too many parties that may or may not have interest.
Yeah.
So being very pointed in what nations are identified as the most impacted and the ones that are going to benefit from those agreements. That's the biggest challenge. What if you have one nation saying no and six are saying yes? How do you navigate that one?
Yeah.
So those are some of the biggest challenges, and I certainly don't have the answers to those, but it's going to take resource to be able to
figure that out. And, you know, on that topic, there's a couple different things I've heard that sound promising and interesting. And one of them was like, you know, you take, you know, the strength of impact, the number of rights holders, you know, proximity, land use and everything. And that's incredible. And like, if you have a significant consensus or majority that support and, you know, there's a small minority that are against, you know, what does that look like? What is the strength of that, you know, the majority that can sort of support? And so I've heard some great recommendations and some great ideas that said, you know what, you know, in terms of, you know, what we can negotiate when we figure out in that whole model, we pass that on to those that don't. We move forward. They still get the benefit of, you know, everything that goes forward. And there's still an emphasis on trying to understand how to, you know, but things have to move forward, right? Because now we're negatively, you know, yes, there's some that don't consent, some that don't understand, or some that, you know, aren't engaged and don't necessarily want to be engaged that way. But how that shouldn't hold up the majority that want to, because it undermines their effort saying, yes, we understand the impacts. We've mitigated, we've accommodated, we've removed impacts, and we have to just keep moving forward and stop getting stuck on that process. The other thing I thought that was really interesting, and I know we've talked a bit about it before, is as we understand consent and we go, it absolutely engage early, prior, right? And so free and informed. But a lot of times, and I've, you know, helped to negotiate some very successful impact benefit agreements, collaboration, whatever you want to call them, where it's about the governance process. Like, we'll give you, yes, consent, but we need, because environmental impacts change and our understanding of the change. Impacts the rights change and everything kind of changes. Do we have confidence that we can come together and then understand these things and still afford, you know, the certainty of the agreement, the certainty of moving this through, of the project going through and then into operation, but the certainty that we can also kind of understand these things, right? Out of a traditional deal making and saying, this is time and day, this is the money, you know, and this is, you know, our jobs and procurement, and we just go forward. Now agreements, they have mechanisms say, okay, let's understand that, and then we'll address that, and we'll address that. And if we address them substantively, we keep moving forward, right? So it takes, I think, it adds emphasis into the coordination, collaboration, the relationship, the partnership, and it takes it away from kind of the litigation aspect, right? And it doesn't treat them as litigation tools, it treats them as relational management tools, right? And so, but yeah, like we have to figure this out. Instead of from a fear perspective, we have to go from an optimist in good faith, like let's advance forward, because back to your earlier point, the world's moving forward, whether or not someone, it's fascinating, and tell me your thoughts on this. Even Indigenous people are saying this. They can build LNG terminals in 8 months. Why can't we do it? Well, they don't have rights bearing Indigenous people in Germany. Yeah. And so and it's like, we can't do that. And so, you know, and maybe we could if we had a bulletproof, strong relationship partnership system where we can integrate and understand and whatever. But to move fast, we need to recognize that, rights has to be at the forefront. We need to talk about that, reconcile that right away, and then get forward.
Yeah, I mean, for certain, Canada's more complex when you come into those conversations that other countries don't have rights holders. But it also makes our country stronger when you think about, say, oil and gas in the world. Canada is, you know, an incredible ethically a place to do business because we are there's high regulation. The Indigenous communities have been in recent, couple decades, few decades, have been very heavily involved in the development of the sector. And there's all these, there's equity, there's gender, there's all these things that make Canada a very strong place to actually do business. So when it gets back to, the idea of building terminals or energy corridors or critical minerals, if we take, I think you've hit a lot of this, but I think if we take, it's a table stakes conversation, like, yes, community's going to have equity, government's going to backstop it so that we can get a reasonable rate, so that we can make the differentials to be able to support our community growth. Yes, communities are going to be at the table in the way that projects get developed, built, operation, decommission, reclamation. Communities are going to be alongside of the table at every step of the way, so that there are no surprises. Communities are along for the whole life cycle of a project. I think that is, we're starting to see that now. Those have to be the table stake questions. Communities can't be going to the table and going, are we going to be a part of this? And are we going to be a real partner or not? Yes, you are. Now, what does that partnership look like? You just let's cut through the stuff, the noise, and just like laser in there. Because when you feel like you've got a seat at the table in a meaningful way, boy, you can move a lot faster than starting at the beginning, fighting for.
Am I going to be involved? How am I going to be involved? Absolutely. And that will expedite. That'll move things forward if we have that trust. And I've heard language, I've heard strong signals from Energy and NRCan, equity is an expectation, and, co-management, co-governance. And no one has said specifically what that looks like. But if we can, again, in good faith, come together and say, you know what, you're going to be a big part. Indigenous communities are a major part. You're going to sit at the table. You're going to help us go through this. We're going to do this together. If government sends those signals, industry's already starting to do it in all their major developments. If governments, and we've heard aspects of, they say that, we'll see communities come up and with that expectation, and then just get to work and just move things forward.
Yeah, and I think government's got a role to play here, but also get out of the way, government. I think a lot of proponents now, when they get it right, are partnering with First Nations and Indigenous communities, Métis Inuit communities, and going, we are the unit now. All that table stake stuff we've talked about, yes, we got how much we've still got to figure out, and how we're going to service the debt and get the capital together, and what the project looks like. When you get a company and First Nations working together, or Métis groups, new communities working together, going to government. Traditionally, that the government might have put up blocks because from a regulatory or not enough capital. To backstop. They sometimes got in the way when companies and communities have already decided we're going to do this together because this is a real partnership, real relationship. So we've got to break down those barriers and make it easier for those partnerships to succeed. And this government is pretty hungry to get this done. It's very evident at the federal level, and we can see it here in Ontario as well. Premier Ford wanted to get projects built. He's made a few missteps, but I like him. I think he wears his heart in his sleeve, and he knows when he makes mistakes, and he's made a couple, and he's apologized for them, and he wants to move forward in a good way with communities. So let's do it. When communities are empowered.
And again, there's a great way to build trust, humility, right? So when you have a leader say, you know what, yes, I'm not perfect, I make mistakes, and then owning them, right? And then where we see the impact of that, and then we move forward and then build that trust and stuff. That's incredibly important. Here, one of the things, you're right. I advocate, I've spoken on it a lot. I don't fault our government there, especially there's a regulatory framework that reflects the relationship we used to have, Indigenous people used to have with resource development. But it's fascinating. I've watched industry leapfrog, and you're right. I've seen them, what they do is that's the requirement. We're 5 steps ahead of that. That's the requirement. We're 5 steps. And where I've seen, and then I think this speaks to your point, is that, we're 5 steps ahead. Why is there not confidence? Why is there a delay? Why? And that's the part where it's okay, we need to honor, they are moving forward. We have industry and communities that are advocating together, and then advocating, we need to move forward. Why do we have another delay? Why do we have another delay? And I think we need to recognize, honor that, and say, okay, there's trust. We can move through. Here's your permits and everything like that, and go through. And so, it's incredibly important.
Yeah, and I think, trust also has to be predicated on the resources so that you can move forward in a good way. And it baffles me sometimes when I think I looked at some companies in the past and even governments to a degree where, they spend all this money. You're an engineer. You spend all the money and time and resources, and you put the human capital forward to get all that work done. Where, there's bright thinkers like that is solvable. If that's, those kind of hard, complex challenges are very doable because you got smart engineers. The human dynamics, that's the soft issues. That's the toughest stuff to deal with. And companies don't put the human capital or the resources to create that trust, create that learning, that informed piece that we've been talking about with nations. You put one person forward managing this major project with a community. It's like, why aren't you putting the same amount of resources forward to make sure that that relationship is solid and that you build that trust? Because if you're not putting the resources, then do I really trust that this is important to you?
Yeah, right. And that's such a strong signal. That's such a great point. And as an engineer, but also as a social scientist, right? And so someone who understands, someone who's probably spent more time in his professional career in the soft side, realizing this is where a lot of the issues are. People can figure out, numbers and ones and zeros and calculations and beep, boop, beep, boop. I always laugh, I'm an engineer, and I think traditionally we saw development as those very technical things, right? Procedurally. Yeah. And it's very different now. It's part, hard issues, but it's also even more so, I think we're finding now, soft issues, right? And I think we need to see that pivot, dedicate that capital to the places where we're having some of our greatest challenges and send the strong signals. And what a great point. I've seen, communities that recognize, look at all the people they have resourced for this. It must be important for engagement and for community engagement and support and development and consultation. There's like teams and people. It must be important, right? We must be important. So what a great point.
And companies have to plan for it, right? They have to, at Mokwateh, our firm, we've got a great team across the country, and we love working with companies that go, listen, we don't understand this space really well. We want to engage, and there's lots of great Indigenous firms out there. We need to engage Indigenous firms to help us build the plan, help us understand how we're going to be able to because, it's not our business to know your business, but it's our business to help you bridge relationships and help you be as successful as you can in your relationships with Indigenous communities so that everybody benefits. And so companies, you really have to spend the time on planning for success. If you don't plan, you're going to fail. And, it's government as well right now. We're seeing a lot of the great signals, again, from the federal government, the Carney government. And, I think, you and I you were just at Stampede, we're having these conversations with the Goldie Hyders of the world, where like people are, I think, very meaningful in trying to figure this out and putting the time and resources into this plan so that we can succeed together. I'm hopeful.
Yeah, absolutely. And, that's another great call to action. There's enough people like yourself. You spend so much time in resource development. And I want to actually touch on some of that history. The JP before CCAB, right? And I've seen pictures and they're awesome, by the way. But, and again, like similarly, as a consultant, even with the IRN, I was an engineer, I was in operations, and now I'm doing so many different things and still some engineering, I'm still operational excellence, all that things, but trying to build those bridges as an Indigenous lived and learn. And what a great call to action. There is enough people like yourself who are running firms, myself, that are a resource to companies that want to build that deeper, to draw on that lived and learned experience, people in resource development who understand engagement, who understand communities. And we need to build stronger, more resilient plans, right, to ensure success. So how did we get that lived and learned experience, right? Where did that come from? Something I don't talk a lot about. I talk a lot about my last 6 or 7 years, but I don't talk a lot about, I spent 17 years in mining, right? In a variety of different capacities. Yeah. But yourself, you spent years in forestry. And, and we hear about all the amazing things now, but how do you get to that place where you can speak to these things with depth, right? And so tell us about JP, the forester.
Yeah. Well, almost 35 years now in the resource sector. Yeah. I mean, my grandfather was a logger in this region. My dad was a logger. My mom's dad on the Scottish side. He helped build the Trans-Canada pipeline just a few miles from here. So I've always been able to play hockey, lower middle class. I had food on the table. And that was because my parents had jobs, and that was the modeling, right? So I knew how important that was. And then, so when I wanted to be a conservation officer, so I went to forestry tech program first in Sioux College. And my first job out of college was working for the First Nations forestry program. So I worked with 40 First Nations across Ontario, from Manitoulin Island up Timmins, Dryden, Port Francis, Kenora, and one northern community, which I'll keep anonymous at this point. But it was one of my very first trips, and I was driving to the community office because we were going to be getting ready for a community tree plant that I was helping with, and I saw this guy, this First Nation guy on the side of the road, and I thought he was hit. I thought he was dead, and so I pulled over right immediately, and it was like in the middle of nowhere, and I kind of rolled him over, like, okay, he's alive, but he was intoxicated, and it was really, really hit me. I'm like, oh. I gave him some water. He didn't want to do anything, so I just left him there. I was like, fuck that. Excuse me, but that really hit me. I'm like, man. And then I go to the community, and then we're in the bush with these families, and you can see the joy, you can see the work ethic, you can see it's making impact. I'm like, I'm seeing both ends of the spectrum here. I gave up my dreams. Basically, at the end of being a conservation officer, like, my dream now is working with community. And that was the turning point in my career to go, I think I can make a difference here. And so, I think like anything, continue to engage, be fearless, know that you belong. If you've been invited into a room, be there, use your voice. Don't be afraid to make mistakes, have mentors. Stretch yourself whenever you can, learn from your mistakes, and I've made them, and build your allies both in community. Now, my friend Roger Wesley is from Constance Lake First Nation, just north of here. He was, when I was living in the duplex a few years ago before building a home here. Roger was sitting on we were having, and we're looking out at the lake here, just like a day like today. And Roger said, there's 4 periods in a person's life, JP. And I've been referencing this often because we can all see ourselves in it. He says adolescence is the time for a person to figure out who they are and what they believe in, and, make your mistakes, have some fun. And, that was my younger years. That's my forestry tech years. I was, making mistakes, but this is my passion. I finally figured out what I wanted to do. I said, the next period in a person's life is being a warrior. And that's when your convictions are like, you are fighting for everything you believe in to make a difference in the world. And that was my CCAB days. Like, really, I was fighting for economic space, in across the country with our nations and communities across the country, and really fighting hard for that. And he said, okay, the next period in your life. And I'm kind of reflecting on, okay, what's the third? He says, a guide. And, a guide is one that helps other warriors figure out the path and support them. I'm like, that's where I am today. I'm more of a guide now. I mean, I still fight for things I'm still got warrior in me. But now, I help guide companies like Suncor and Superior Plus. I'm on the board of Institute for Corporate Directors, guiding our company, guiding my daughter, guiding you on the lake so you can get that 7-pound pickerel, you big fish slayer. So guiding others. And I'm really enjoying this period of my life. And then Roger said, the fourth is, that of an elder, the person that binds the community, that is the connection to the history, whether adolescent, the warrior, or the guide, we all look to that elder. And, we're so lucky we get there. I'm not in that elder stage, even though I got lots of gray hair. I've got a little bit ways to go yet. But, I think, that those reflections and understanding who you are, your responsibilities to your community, responsibilities to your own values, living a good life, doing the best you can, and then kind of reflecting back about what drove you in the first place. And here we are on the land, and I prefer to be on the land and visit the cities. I'm in a beautiful place to be able to do that, and it always regrounds me. And I'm so glad that you got to experience some of this as well, because we better understand when we visit each other in our place of origins, and that helps build better understanding so that we can be better leaders and advocates for the good things that need to happen in this country.
Absolutely. It's incredibly powerful. Always, it's the huge sigh. Like, it's an important, incredible story. And, that should resonate with anyone, right? And so it's absolutely beautiful. And I think about, you actually made me think about something I didn't talk about too much. And so I'm still a nerd. I'm an Indigenous nerd, nerd, all those type of
You know what
things.
they call nerds later in life, right? Boss. Okay, go
Yes,
ahead, nerd
exactly.
boss. Yeah.
Nerd boss, yeah. And so, so anyway, like math, science and all that type of thing. And then, got into health and safety, environmental science, health physics. I get in all sorts of, I loved it. I love nuclear science, alpha, beta, gamma, protection, blah, blah, blah. But as I was doing that and I was learning all the nerdy things and I loved it and that was my life. And there was a moment, that was pretty profound. And it was when, through the summers, I saw a lot of Northern Indigenous students who used to come and work at the sites. And they were engineering students or science or doing really neat things. First year, loved to get to meet them. And I wouldn't see them back the next year. And if I did, they would move on to different programs and they would move out of programs that I knew them fully well capable of doing. And I really struggled with that. And you could see, yeah, and where are the ones that didn't come back? What are they doing? And that was really powerful to me and actually started me down a path of civil service and leadership from that perspective and building out organizations and outreach and advocacy and STEM and stuff like that. But yeah, then I started really recognizing all those profound experiences that brought me back to community and community service. I love doing the nerdy things and I still do the nerdy things and I still can build the spreadsheets, wizard in the sheets, as some say, between whatever. We won't
Go there.
yeah, in the Excel sheets. But no, loved all the nerdy things, but always drawn back to community in much the same way. The work that we do, always drawn back to community. And there's an element of service there that is profoundly important, right?
Yeah, there is. And we still challenge. It's one of the biggest challenges in our when we look at our communities. And I just recently have gone through the lateral violence in our communities, which holds some of us back. We got to look beyond that, and we got to try to support those that are still hurting from a lot of the colonialistic. I mean, I see it in my community. I see it in my own, my relatives. There's some big challenges, and it's disheartening in many ways, especially when you're personally attacked so much.
Yeah.
But I think we have to look beyond that and continue to work hard and push hard for our communities. Because I always there's two things. There's no shortcuts. And my father used to always say, like, I was a pretty good hockey player, but I was the guy on the ice. My dad would always say, one more lap.
Yeah.
Like everybody else you do the extra work. What you put in the washer is what you're going to get out. So no shortcuts. And then the long view. I think at the end of the day, the long view, when you take that, and I think our communities traditionally, we think about 7-generational thinking about the long view, long term. Eventually it all comes out, eventually history is being written in all of our worlds, all of our lives. And at the end of it, it will all come out. And having that mindset is really important. And we think about the world today and look at some of these international leaders in the world. History is being written, and I think about the impacts that they're both the good and the bad that they're having. Bringing that down to a community level, we still have to think about those long views because the history is being written. And at the end of the day, you need to be able to hold your head up high, I think, and think about hopefully most of the positive stuff that you're going to have in the world, the impact that you're going to have in the world.
Yeah, no, that's powerful. I think about Canada. I think about like the empathy needed to really move our communities forward. But there's something that resonates so strongly what you said. And our parents are our greatest role models and mentors and everything. And my dad used to always say, there's only a dime's difference between first class and no class. There's just a little bit more effort to put in, so do the work and no shortcuts. And, that's incredibly important. But also, only I can really look after myself, and only I can really, I'm only got to do the things I did because of the communities that are around us and the social supports and people and stuff. But at the same time, it's through my initiative. No one else is going to stand me up. No one else is going to put me through that door. No one else is going to, you talked about showing up, being present. No one is going to do that but me. Yes, everyone will give me opportunity, support and everything, but we really have to start taking responsibility, move ourselves through, be positive. We have so much tough history, so much socioeconomic baggage, but you got to start somewhere, and you got to move forward, and you got to take some responsibility for some of those aspects.
And open doors for others. You know, that call that
Yes.
you and I were on the other day, and you know, Desjarlais, who's part of a senior team member in Mokwateh, you know, you were very kind in your words of, you know, that, you know, we've been able to ride the wake of like the Phil Fontaines of the world as an example, right? And now it's our responsibility, I think, to, you know, as Dad says, we have to make those next waves, though we have to own those next waves, and providing space for that next generation of leadership to come forward and making room and acknowledgement is really important, because we can't do it ourselves. And not only that for Indigenous leaders, but also our allies. You know, a little shout out to Max, the managing partner at Mokwateh. You know, I've known him. We worked together at CCIB, and you know, he's got a heart of gold, and he wants to do good work in our communities. And you know, making some space for our allies is really because we're such a small portion of the population. There's so much work to do that we can't do it alone.
Absolutely, and we need sincere, genuine allies like Max, like, and we need to celebrate that, and we need to like mobilize that, right, more and more and more, and just get to better and better places. We are in such a good place as it relates to, or as compared to where we were, and then we'll be in an even much better place. But we all need to kind of come together, own it, come together, recognize the support and mentorship. I'm on your wake, and then I'm making sure there's a big wake behind me, you know, with a bunch of other youngsters that are, you know, but they got to get onto that board. And then ride that wake. I'm going to make that wake and get on that board, and I'll make sure that wake is high and going to take you further than where I've went and everything like that. But yeah, we'll have a good time. Well, me and you could talk forever. We do. We actually do. We do talk forever. But I mean, in the interest of, kind of wrapping things up here today, again, it is an absolute honor. I am, you know, nothing but, you know, sincerely and genuinely appreciative of opening up your home, bringing me to your community, you know, and getting to talk and getting to know JP. And we spent a lot of time together, but like you said, connecting together on the land as Indigenous people, as Indigenous men, doing the things that define us and identify us, make this experience that much more special. So thank you so much, JP, for being our guest on the IRN podcast. Thank you. We didn't talk about much about it before, but on this episode, but thank you for your work. We stood up the network alongside, and it's a big part through your leadership and being the inaugural executive director. Thank you so much for your contributions to society, to Canada, to Indigenous communities, to me, to the network. And, you know, I look forward to the next time that we spend some time together.
Maybe it'll be over a moose hunt this fall.
Maybe it will be. Maybe it will be.
My daughter can show us the way.
She could show. I would love that. Yeah, I would love that. That would be absolutely incredible.
Hello, my name is JP Gladu. Mokwateh is my Indigenous name. It means bear heart. I'm from Sandpoint First Nation. I'm here in the community, also principal of Mokwateh, as well as a founding member of the Indigenous Resource Network.